Wow, is there a lot for us to talk about this week? President Biden announced he's dropping out of the race, and now comes the inevitable slew of almost entirely useless predictive stuff in the media. I'll tell you what to watch out for and what not to get caught up in. Meanwhile, I told you there would be hypocrisy in coverage of the assassination attempt at a Trump rally, and of course, that happened. I'll break it down for you with one story in particular that was screaming for context. Plus, how the media handles conspiracy theories. There's this one step that news organizations should basically always take when these theories take off. Also today, something that the media obviously need to stop doing, particularly when it comes to anything involving Trump. It's so obvious, but they keep doing it anyway, which means that you don't get the truth. And as though all that isn't enough, there's also news on another front. This one involves Israel, and it's something I've been hearing from so many people about over the last few days, because something that I covered in the earliest episodes of this show, which just launched a few months ago, is now back at the top of global news, and a lot of news organizations are just blowing it. One news agency with a particularly bad track record on Israel actually pulled something because it was so blatantly offensive. I'll explain. All right, let's do this. It's all coming up today here on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Libbs. This is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact checks the news. I spent 20 years in the media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN, including as a fact checker on air and online. I saw through all that systemic problems in the news media, and they've only gotten worse. But now we're fighting back. We're pushing the media to do a better job, holding them accountable. With each episode, I send out a newsletter. It's packed with links and information and images, all kinds of stuff. After all, I'm not asking you or anyone to take my word for anything. The newsletter is free, and if you choose to support this show by becoming a paid subscriber at the newsletter, then you get access to me through the comment section, and I can thank you on air. I'll be doing more of that in the future. I was going to get to some of those today, but I'm actually recording this in a compressed time frame because I was one of the many millions of people affected by the global internet outage. I was on a family trip, and flight home got delayed by 48 hours. Anyway, I'm back. And let's start today with what is currently the biggest news. Now that President Biden is dropping out of the presidential race, news agencies are, of course, having endless sessions asking random guests or calling up analysts and saying, hey, how will this affect the race? Newsflash, almost no one knows how it will affect the race. Over the years, I have seen so many cases in which news agencies just have something to talk about, to fill space about, and they don't know what to say. So they just start asking everyone for opinions. And it's easy to get caught up in theories, but the truth is there are so many unknowns. And as big as this is, there will be more and more and more giant events between now and the election. Every few days, there will probably be another giant event. Of course, probably nothing as big as a new candidate. I'm going to be keeping an eye on how often actual facts make it through all the noise. Like, how often are news agencies saying to you, here's where each party has proven strengths in various states, and here's what they need to do specifically. Here are actual calculations that went into Biden's decision. Facts. And track records of all the candidates for president and vice president, what they've actually said and done, policies that they talk about, the things they actually want to do, instead of all the yapping about the horse race. We need more concrete stuff coming from the media. So that is what I'm going to keep an eye out for in the coming weeks. When you see instances that you think are good or bad, go ahead and send them in to me. I'd love to see them. If you are not a paid subscriber at the newsletter, you can find a form at my website, joshlivs.com. You can reach me that way as well. Meanwhile, last week, I gave you a heads up that I'd be looking out for a certain kind of hypocrisy in coverage of the awful assassination attempt at a Trump rally that killed a man and wounded 2 other people. Here's a quick clip of something I said last week. There should be 0 interviews in which Republicans accuse Democrats of creating an environment for political violence without journalists pushing back and saying, wait a second, you're the party of January 6th, AR-15s being widely available, constant talk of traitors deserving the death penalty. The Charlottesville Nazis praised Trump, and Trump has encouraged some types of violence. Also, does anyone even remember when he said Second Amendment people could help stop Hillary Clinton? What kind of environment did that contribute to? Journalists have an obligation to point this stuff out every time. Of course, the media did not do that as a standard practice. Lots of news coverage included stuff like this. Here's an example from NBC News. This was from before J.D. Vance was announced as Trump's running mate.
Not everyone was quick to put aside the partisan rhetoric. Ohio Republican Senator J.D. Vance, cited as one of Trump's possible VP picks, blamed the attack via social media on the Democratic Party.
That is the kind of place in which the media should point out the amount of violent rhetoric that has come from the right. This is a place that journalists should push back. For example, reach out to Vance and say, hey, what about all these examples? But it gets worse. There was all this news coverage about something President Biden had said. Here's a clip from CBS, which includes a clip of their interview with the president.
Some Republicans say his comments that he made on a call to donors when he used the phrase, it's time to put Trump in the bullseye, perhaps incited the shooting.
I didn't say crosshairs. I meant bullseye. I meant focus on him. Focus on what he's doing.
Okay, so in there, you heard from Biden an important reference that somehow the media just seemed to miss. Biden pointed out that he had not said crosshairs. That is when the media should point out something that happened involving a leading Republican figure, Sarah Palin, a former vice presidential candidate. She faced a situation more than 10 years ago, but it remained in the news for years. Here's a clip about it. This is from CNN in 2017.
Palin's political operation made a map showing blue congressional districts under crosshairs. When Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was nearly killed in 2011, critics brought up that Palin graphic. Some tried to blame her, but there was never any known link between the map and the massacre.
There is also no known link between Biden saying something about a bullseye and this attempted assassination. There's no reason to believe that this 20-year-old would-be assassin even knew what Biden said to a group of donors on a phone call. So when Biden points out that he didn't say crosshairs, the media should point to this example and show that Sarah Palin faced those accusations, and she said she was not calling for violence. It's up to the media to provide this kind of context, show that these kinds of attacks have gone both ways. Meanwhile, the assassination attempt, of course, spurred conspiracy theories. There is one step that the media should always take when these conspiracy theories begin to grow in the wake of any major event. That after this quick break. Support comes from Mit45, which is part of a quickly growing market for products that include kratom. Mit45 wants to make sure people don't overuse it or use it in any other dangerous ways. They're leading the way with labeling and warnings, and they want federal regulators to regulate the industry. And this goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Don't put any substances into your body based on anything you hear me say. Talk to your healthcare providers. A couple of days after the attempted assassination at a Trump rally, I was in an elevator in beautiful Old Orchard Beach, Maine. There were these two guys on the elevator with me. One of them brought up a very well-known right-wing firebrand, a woman who just loves to say controversial stuff and sell books and things. Anyway, he said he loves her, and the other one said, yeah, she's great. And then the first one said, she is saying that there's no way the Secret Service missed the threat to Trump, that they must have allowed it to happen. And the other one said, yep, he shared that belief. Similar conversations were happening across the country, probably among millions of people. This stuff is impossible to quantify, but we note that the conspiracy theories are widespread. And not just on that one side. There are also conspiracy theories that Trump staged it for sympathy. I cannot fact check whether there was some kind of conspiracy. But here's what I can tell you. So many conspiracy theories have the same false basis. You see it in conspiracy theories about so many other things, including the October 7th massacres by Hamas in Israel, and 9/11, the September 11th attacks in the United States, and so much else. This basis is the myth of invincibility. That is the starting point. It's the idea that it's somehow unthinkable that this could happen. Here's a PBS interview from October 8th of last year.
The question, and much like the question that was asked in America after 9/11, is how could this happen? How could Israeli intelligence miss the planning for this?
There are conspiracy theories that Israel somehow knew and let it happen. There's one I've seen in which people claim that Israel and the United States have secretly known all along where the hostages are and have been refusing to save them so that they can continue the war. This is QAnon-level bonkers conspiracy stuff. But the argument that they use is, well, Israel and the United States have the top armies and intelligence services, so they must know. This is the same idea. The idea that something is invincible. So if something goes wrong, if they miss something, if something falls apart, if something is inadequate, well, there had to be a conspiracy. The reality is there are no foolproof systems. We know this on some rational level probably, but we don't always believe it or allow ourselves to believe it. Maybe it's a lie we tell ourselves that in some situations everything is perfectly safe, perfectly covered. But the truth is there are always holes in every system. So it's not unthinkable that the Secret Service and other authorities involved in protecting former presidents and candidates at these events messed up. In fact, here's something NBC News reported.
The United States Secret Service, according to multiple sources to NBC News, say that they identified this location where the shooting allegedly occurred as a potential vulnerability in the days before the event. The Secret Service tonight, in a statement from a spokesperson, says that they had designated that rooftop under the jurisdiction of local law enforcement, and that's a common practice with securing these outdoor rallies and these outdoor events.
The investigation is continuing. There's still a lot that needs to be figured out. And asking how this happened is essential. But being shocked that it could happen is a problem. It could. It can. There's a woman I know. She's a fan of this show, actually. She gave it a great blurb, which is on my website. You can see it. Her name is Pamela Meyer, and she's known as the country's top lie spotter. She gave one of the top TED Talks of all time, How to Spot a Liar. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. She did this great report about this after the October 7th massacres in Israel. She explained that every military, every country, every group of human beings ever can be fooled. That piece she did is in U.S. News and World Report. I'll include a link to it in the newsletter. There's a famous quote that I often think of that speaks to this. It's from 1984, not the book, the actual year. The Irish Republican Army set off a bomb trying to kill people, including then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. They failed in that effort, but they put out an ominous warning. Here was Canadian broadcaster Knowlton Nash reporting on that warning.
The IRA issued a statement just hours after the bombing, and there was a chilling message for Thatcher and for her fellow Conservatives. The statement said, "Today we were unlucky, but remember, we only have to be lucky once. You have to be lucky always."
I think of that often when these things happen. Bad actors only have to get lucky once. They might try repeatedly, but eventually they find a weakness. They exploit it. That's also why when it comes to stories that focus on terrorism, I always keep in mind that in this way, terrorists always have the upper hand. When your goal is to kill civilians who live in a free society where they're allowed to go places, you're probably going to find a way. I think of that every time I hear this term used about Israel fighting Palestinian terrorists. Asymmetric. Here's one of many examples. This one is from NPR in 2014.
This is an asymmetric conflict. The Israeli Air Force and air defenses are state-of-the-art, while Hamas rockets, even as they make life very difficult in towns near Gaza, seem to inflict relatively little damage.
That always makes it sound like one side is so strong, the other side doesn't stand a chance. But when the goal of one side, Palestinian terrorists in this case, is to target and kill civilians, they only have to get lucky once. See, the asymmetry isn't just about having different weapons, it's also about having different goals. And when it comes to protecting people from terrorism anywhere, including in Israel, people trying to prevent terrorist attacks have to be lucky every time. That is its own form of disadvantage. Now, of course, all these protections are not about luck. They're about doing everything you can to prevent these things from happening. But the point is that systems are created by people, and there will always be flaws and holes and gaps. They need to be discovered. They need to be fixed. It's not okay. But they do happen, and it does not take a conspiracy for those holes to exist. By the way, this is why companies hire hackers to try to break into their systems, because they know that there are holes somewhere. They want to find them and fix them. We could even see this myth of invincibility in a literal way, with people who believe that on 9/11, the towers in New York City somehow didn't fall due to the airplanes, but that there had to have been some sort of inside job. That has been debunked repeatedly by lots of people who understand architecture and engineering and other dynamics at play. As a non-expert, to me, it just seems like logic. How could the buildings not fall? Passenger jets slammed into them at hundreds of miles per hour. I saw one estimate that the jets weighed 136 tons each. Much of that was fuel, but to some people, the buildings had to have been invincible to these planes. The conspiracy theory surrounding the 2020 election also operates on this same myth. To the many people in Trump world who believe it, he is invincible, so he couldn't possibly have lost at the ballot box. It had to be some conspiracy. So here's what the media should do. Every time there is a conspiracy theory about anything, step one, say, let's run this past the myth of invincibility. Does believing in this conspiracy theory require us to start off with a belief that the system we're talking about was foolproof, that there were no flaws that a bad actor could exploit? See, when we remember that there are no foolproof systems, that bad actors only have to get lucky once, and then they can do horrible things, do we still jump to the conclusion that there has to be a conspiracy? That is a perfect example of a role for the media in addressing these. All right, meanwhile, some big news that is suddenly making things I covered early on in this show as important as ever. That's after this. Thank you, Nextiva, the platform powering more than 100,000 businesses and billions of conversations every year. Nextiva integrates all conversation channels and powers personalized experiences at scale throughout the entire customer journey. Say goodbye to siloed apps and say hello to the unified customer conversation solution. Learn more at nextiva.com. We're back. This is They Stand Corrected. I'm Josh Libbs. The International Court of Justice has been in the news in recent days. Here's PBS.
The UN's top court says that Israel's rule over the Palestinian-occupied territories is, quote, unlawful.
And CNN.
The International Court of Justice says Israel's settlements in the occupied West Bank and the occupation of East Jerusalem are illegal.
So many news stories are about the very moment that you're living in. That's often what makes them news. But this is about a story that is literally millennia old, because Jewish people have managed to survive and outlast the empires. Jewish, as in people of Judea, a place. What happened now, as I said, involves the International Court of Justice. That's different from the International Criminal Court. This stuff gets confusing, I know. The ICJ gave an opinion. And to be fair, news agencies this time actually did generally point out that it's just an opinion. It's not an international law. Here's the BBC, for example.
The ICJ's advisory opinion is not legally binding, but it's the first time it has delivered a position on the legality of the 57-year occupation.
No, there is no 57-year occupation. This is where the whole show began. It was what I focused on in the first episode, false reporting about occupation, because it's just so concrete. It's such a clear example of the media having a totally different set of rules just for Israel that don't even make sense. I explained in episode 1 that there are lots of territories around the world that are occupied, but you never hear that. Meanwhile, Gaza and the West Bank, by most traditional definitions, do not meet that standard. Israel left Gaza in 2005, and over in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority controls the Palestinian areas, and it submitted paperwork to the United Nations last year about Jericho, saying that the Israeli occupation period ended in 1994. You never hear any of this in the news. In another early episode, I focused on international law. For decades, news organizations have been falsely reporting that Israel is somehow definitively breaking international law by allowing people to live in parts of the West Bank. Now, in this latest reporting, news agencies are actually admitting that, for the first time, this top court is giving an opinion. So that effectively means they're admitting that they've been saying something for decades with no basis. This is complicated, which is why I did episodes on them. I encourage you to go back and listen to the early episodes in which I talk you through these issues. I also did an explainer on why the term the West Bank exists. It's called that because Jordan occupied it. You can hear that as well in a two-parter that I did about Jordan. I will link to all these in the newsletter so you can find them really easily. Here now is a clip from a Jerusalem Post story from just a few days ago, explaining what an Israeli leader says about this latest opinion from the International Court of Justice.
N.K. Yuli Edelstein, chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, called the decision another illusory and despicable decision of the court in The Hague, which was hijacked by Islamists and their supporters, and turned from a court of justice into a court of empowering and encouraging terrorism.
U.S. lawmaker Richie Torres wrote about this. He's a Democratic congressman from New York who's terrific on this stuff. He wrote on social media that this decision asserts that it's illegal for there to be a Jewish sovereign presence in the Jewish quarter of the Old City, the Western Wall, and the Temple Mount, the holiest sites in Judaism. He said an ICJ that definitively prejudges Jewish sovereignty over these Jewish sites to be illegitimate outside the context of bilateral negotiations between Israel and Palestinians is exposing its own illegitimacy. He also rightfully pointed out that the October 7th massacres should have opened the world's eyes to Hamas being the greatest obstacle to peace, their violent extremism. It was actually from his feed that I first learned about something else that happened in recent days. The Washington Post actually pulled a tweet. Now, if you followed this show, then you might know the Washington Post has one of the worst track records in covering Israel. Recently, they published this really disgusting tweet. They were criticizing the parents of an Israeli hostage. All right, the tweet said that this hostage, Omer Neutra, they called him someone who has been missing since the October 7th attack on Israel. They didn't say hostage, nothing about that in this tweet. And then they went straight into a complaint saying that when his parents speak publicly, they don't talk about Israel's assault on Gaza that has killed. And then they went on with a number of Palestinians who have allegedly been killed, according to local officials. The numbers they were using were Hamas numbers, and they didn't say that. I even checked the story they were linking to, and they didn't say it there either. Also, why the hell should this hostage's parents be talking about that? But something I reported, and this was in episode 12, was that a bunch of people at the Post who are leading the coverage of all things Israel right now are former employees of the Qatari government, having worked for its state-owned propaganda channel, which you know as Al Jazeera. Meanwhile, lost in all this was something else about the Washington Post story, which brings us full circle back to U.S. politics. Omer Neutra's parents, Orna and Ronan Neutra, they had been invited to speak at the Republican National Convention. They accepted it, not for any political reasons. They're talking anywhere that people will listen. The Post had this morsel in the story about what Trump's team wanted them to do.
There were things that the convention speechwriters working with the Neutras wanted them to say that they were not comfortable saying. We're probably going to be the only speech where there's not going to be Trump, 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 said Ronan. We're not going to say that only he can bring them home.
Well, that's good. So gross for anyone to try to get them to say that. Any American administration should be fully supportive in getting him home. He's among 8 American hostages still being held. And the Neutras said the Biden administration has always been responsive and that they've met with senior officials from the president on down. And finally for today, a big way that the nation's newspapers blew it in covering Trump's speech at the RNC. They wrote their headlines for the next day before the speech actually happened. They prepared their big front page headlines and leads based on his written speech that they were provided in advance. A writer named Parker Malloy did a great job of collecting all these headlines from papers around the country that were just wrong. All these headlines were saying, Trump emphasizes unity, Trump takes a unity tone, Trump calls for unity. That was because his speechwriters had lines like that in the speech early on. But of course, in reality, he went off script and into his bitterness and grievances and a lot of nonsensical gobbledygook, including something about Hannibal Lecter, one of his favorite topics. And I can't believe I'm going to say this, but here's a quick side note about Hannibal Lecter. There's a good report from New York Magazine that explains that his constant references to this fictional character make even less sense in context. There's also a piece from CNN last year in which they explained that his own campaign doesn't have any source to back up the kind of claim that he is apparently trying to make. Also, he keeps talking about Hannibal Lecter as though it's a real person, apparently in reference to someone who has played that character, and he claims that that person supports him, but no one playing that character supports him. Anyway, it's just a fact that Trump obviously has no desire to unite America. His whole campaign is about divisiveness, getting a big chunk of America to hate another chunk of America. Why would any news agency think he was going to stick to the speech that other people wrote that aren't the kinds of things that he obviously believes and likes to say? All candidates have speechwriters, but most candidates actually do read much of what's in those speeches. So, note to the media, stop assuming Trump is going to do what the campaign tells you he's going to do. When you do that, you fail in your mission. All right, that's it for today. Coming up next week, the polls, what they mean, what they don't mean, what they might or might not show now that Biden is out of the race, and a lot more. Send me your questions about polls. I'm actually already getting some of these questions from you, and I'm going to try to tackle them in the next episode. Reminder that you can sign up for the free newsletter, and if you're a paid subscriber, then you can message me and write in the comments there and take part in discussions and support the show. You can find everything you need at joshlebs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. It's so great to have you here. Talk to you next week. Wait, before you go, one super quick thing we need you to do. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, then go rate and review this show. Give it 5 stars. Write something terrific about it. That's how people find the show. And if you're listening on Spotify, you can rate the show as well. Again, give it that highest rating. You can grab a screenshot and send it to us, and we'll send you a little gift in the mail.